You have 48 hours, Kowalski. The money, or your daughter. Elena heard those words through the thin wall of her apartment in Kazimierz, Krakow, and felt the blood freeze in her veins. The November night was bitterly cold, but the chill spreading through her body now came from somewhere much deeper. This wasn't a surprise. She'd known this day was coming. She stood frozen in the dark hallway, barefoot on the cold tiles, listening to the low, calm voice of the man on the other side of the door. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. There was something in his tone far more terrifying than anger, absolute certainty. Her father, Thomas Kowalski, was murmuring something about more time, about one more chance. Elena could hear the desperation in his voice, that same pathetic tone that had followed him for months, ever since the casinos and the underground poker rooms swallowed everything they had. 250,000 zloty. A sum so astronomical Elena couldn't even wrap her mind around it. A sum that had turned her from a daughter into merchandise. The door swung open. Elena stepped back into the shadows instinctively, but it was already too late. The man in the sharp black suit stopped in the doorway, and his dark eyes found her immediately. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood two more men, just as well dressed, their faces stripped of any emotion. Professionals. That's her, the first man said, studying Elena with something that could have been appreciation or evaluation. He was tall, around 40, with a face that had seen too much. Mr. Moretti will be pleased. Moretti. That name moved through Krakow in whispers, always tied to stories of people who vanished, debts that were never repaid, and blood on the pavement. Dante Moretti was a legend in Krakow's underworld, an Italian immigrant who, 2 decades earlier, had seized control of a considerable share of the city's illegal operations. Casinos, loan sharking, protection. His empire was vast, and it was merciless. Elena never imagined she'd hear that name attached to her own life. Please, her father whispered, still sitting at the kitchen table, his head buried in his hands. She has nothing to do with this. It's my debt. The man in the suit smiled coldly. That's exactly the point, Kowalski. It's your debt, and you have nothing to pay it with. But you have a daughter. He turned to Elena. Pack your things. You have 10 minutes. Elena's heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. This felt surreal. This couldn't actually be happening. She was in 21st century Krakow, not some medieval fairy tale. People weren't sold like goods, and yet that was exactly what was happening. And if I refuse? The words left her mouth before she could stop them. Her voice shook, but it carried. The man raised an eyebrow, as if the question surprised him, maybe even amused him. Then your father is found floating in the Vistula before sunrise, and we come for you anyway. So really, which option sounds better to you? Elena looked at her father. Thomas Kowalski finally lifted his head. His face was gray, his eyes bloodshot and empty. In that moment, Elena saw the truth. He had already given up. He had already sold her in his mind, probably weeks ago, when the debt became impossible to repay. All his promises that he'd fix it, that he'd find a way, they'd been lies. Whether he told them to her or to himself didn't matter anymore. Something inside Elena broke. It wasn't despair, that would come later. It was a cold, hard acceptance. Her life, as she'd known it, had just ended. 10 minutes, she repeated quietly, and turned toward her small bedroom. Her hands trembled as she stuffed clothes into an old gym bag, the kind of bag you take when you're being sold to a gangster. The thought was so absurd, she almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat. She packed the basics. Jeans, sweaters, underwear, a few cosmetics. Her fingers paused over a photograph on the nightstand. Her and her mother, taken a few years before her mother's death. Her mother wore a warm smile, one arm around a young Elena. Both of them looked happy. Elena took the photo and tucked it into the bottom of the bag. There was no point taking anything else. This little apartment, everything in it, none of it was really hers. Maybe it never had been. Everything her father owned had been borrowed time, built on debts and lies. When she came back into the living room, her father was still at the table. He didn't look up. Elena waited a moment, giving him the chance to say something, anything. An apology, an explanation, a goodbye. But Thomas Kowalski stayed silent, staring at the empty table as if the answers were carved into its scarred surface. Ready, the man in the suit said. He didn't wait for a response. He motioned toward the door. Elena crossed the threshold without looking back. If she did, she might fall apart, and she couldn't afford that. Not now. She had to be strong, at least for the moment. Outside, a cold November rain was falling. The streets of Casimir's were nearly empty at this hour, only a few figures hurrying under umbrellas. A black Mercedes waited by the curb, its engine purring softly. One of the men opened the back door, and Elena climbed in, feeling the leather seat cold beneath her thighs. The car pulled away smoothly, winding through the narrow streets of the old town. Elena watched the scenes pass by the window, the round building in Nowy Square, the small cafes and bars she recognized by sight. Everything looked ordinary, normal. The world went on, indifferent to the fact that her life had just been turned upside down. "Where are we going?" she asked, surprising herself. Her voice sounded calmer than she felt. The man in the passenger seat, not the one who'd spoken in the apartment, but a younger one with a scar on his cheek, turned slightly. "Podgorze, Mr. Moretti's property." Podgorze, the district across the Vistula, where old apartment blocks stood shoulder to shoulder with expensive new residences. Elena had only been there a handful of times, always feeling like an intruder in that part of the city where money spoke louder than words. The drive took barely 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. The Mercedes finally passed through a tall iron gate that opened automatically. Beyond it stretched a private, gravel-covered drive leading to an imposing villa. The building was modern but carried touches of classical architecture, tall windows, stone columns, a balcony on the second floor. It was lit up, warm light spilling from the windows onto the wet gravel. The car stopped in front of the main entrance. The driver, silent the entire trip, stepped out and opened the door for Elena. She took a deep breath and got out, feeling the cold rain immediately soak her hair and clothes. The front door opened before they could even approach it. An older woman appeared in the doorway, wearing an elegant black dress, her hair pulled into a tight bun. Her face was severe, but not unkind. "This is Elena Kowalska," said the scarred man. "Mr. Moretti expects her in the morning. Show her to her room now." The woman nodded. "Come with me, child." Elena followed her inside, crossing into a world as luxurious as it was terrifying. The interior of the villa was even more impressive than the outside. Marble floors, a crystal chandelier hanging in the entryway, sweeping staircases leading to the second floor. Everything was immaculate and elegant, like something out of a design magazine. The older woman led her upstairs and down a long hallway, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. Finally, she stopped in front of one of the doors and opened it, gesturing for Elena to go in. "This will be your room. The bathroom's there," she said, pointing to another door. "If you need anything, ring the bell. Breakfast is at 8. Mr. Moretti wants to see you at 10. Elena stepped into the room, barely registering its lavish furnishings. A large four-poster bed, heavy drapes, elegant furniture. Everything was done in cream and gold, refined and impersonal, like a hotel room. "What's your name?" Elena asked, turning toward the woman. Something crossed the older woman's face, something that might have been surprise, or maybe approval. "Maria. I'm the house manager." "Maria." Elena nodded. "Thank you." Maria hesitated for a moment, as if she wanted to say something more, but in the end she only nodded and closed the door, leaving Elena alone. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena let her bag drop to the floor and sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. The mattress was soft, too soft, after the hard bed in her old apartment. Everything here was too much, too big, too luxurious, too foreign. Only now, in the silence of this strange room, did she let the emotions come. Tears filled her eyes, hot and unstoppable. She cried in silence, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with quiet sobs. She cried for the freedom she'd lost, for the father who had betrayed her, for the mother who was no longer there to protect her. She cried for the terror of what was coming, and eventually the tears dried, leaving only exhaustion. Elena peeled off her wet clothes and found soft robes hanging in the bathroom. She wrapped herself in one, feeling the luxury of the fabric against her skin. Even that felt ironic, surrounded by luxury while being a prisoner. She lay down on the bed without bothering to pull back the sheets. Sleep felt impossible, but her body was drained from the adrenaline and the emotion. She closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the strange, enormous house around her. The creak of old wood, distant footsteps, the whisper of rain against the windows. Her last thought before falling into an uneasy sleep was simple and terrifying. Tomorrow I meet the man who bought me. Morning came too fast. Elena woke disoriented for a moment, not knowing where she was. Then it all came flooding back in a violent wave. She sat up sharply, her heart racing, and looked toward the window. The light filtering through the heavy curtains was pale and cold. A typical November morning in Krakow. She checked her phone on the nightstand. 7:30. 30 minutes until breakfast. Elena got up and went to the bathroom, hoping the hot water would help wake her up and give her the nerve for what was coming. The bathroom was as luxurious as the rest of the room. Marble surfaces, a large shower, cosmetics in elegant jars. She took a long shower, letting the hot water wash the tension out of her muscles. When she finally stepped out, wrapped in a warm towel, she noticed someone had been in the room while she was gone. New clothes lay across the bed. An elegant navy dress, simple but clearly expensive, and matching shoes. Elena touched the fabric. Soft. Probably costly. She dressed quickly, feeling strange in these unfamiliar clothes. The dress fit her perfectly, which was both surprising and unsettling. Someone knew her size. Someone had been preparing for this moment. At exactly 8, there was a knock on the door. Maria walked in without waiting for a response, nodding approvingly at the sight of Elena dressed and ready. Come. Breakfast. The dining room was on the ground floor, a spacious room with a long table that could seat 12. Now it was set for one, at the end, near a window overlooking the garden. Elena sat down carefully while Maria brought out food. Fresh rolls, cheese, cold cuts, eggs, coffee. It was far too much for one person. Has Mr. Moretti already eaten? Elena asked, more to fill the silence than out of real curiosity. Mr. Moretti rarely eats breakfast, Maria answered, pouring the coffee. He's been working since 6. Elena drank her coffee, too nervous to eat. Her stomach was tied in a knot. At 10, she would meet the man who controlled her fate, the man she'd only ever heard of in legend and rumor. A mob boss. Cruel. Ruthless. Cold. But there was another rumor, too. One Elena had once heard. That Dante Moretti wasn't a typical gangster. That he was cultured, educated, that he read books and collected art. That his cruelty was a matter of business, not nature. Elena didn't know which version to believe. Maybe both were true. Maybe neither. 9:55 came too quickly. Maria appeared again and motioned to Elena. It's time. They walked together through the house, passing more lavish rooms. Maria finally stopped in front of a set of heavy oak doors and knocked once, gently. Come in, said a voice on the other side. Deep, with a barely perceptible Italian accent. Maria opened the door and gestured Elena forward. Good luck, child, she whispered before stepping away, leaving Elena alone. Elena took a deep breath and stepped into the study. The room was dark despite the morning hour. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light. The walls were lined with bookshelves reaching from floor to ceiling. A piano stood in one corner, its black lacquer gleaming. And behind a massive mahogany desk sat the man. Dante Moretti. Elena hadn't known what to expect, but it wasn't this. He was younger than she'd imagined, maybe 35, 38. Dark hair, carefully combed back, features sharp and strong, almost sculpted. His eyes were nearly black, intelligent and piercing. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing muscled forearms. He didn't look like a gangster. He looked like a businessman, a professor, someone who could give a lecture or speak at a conference. He studied her for a long moment without saying anything. His gaze was assessing, but not in the way she'd expected. He wasn't looking at her like an object. He was looking at her like a puzzle he was trying to solve. Elena Kowalska, he said finally. His voice was calm, measured. Sit. Elena sat in the chair across the desk, her hands clenched over her knees. Her heart was pounding, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. Do you know why you're here? Dante continued. It wasn't really a question. Yes, Elena answered. My father couldn't pay his debt, so he paid with me. Something crossed Dante's face too quickly for Elena to identify. Your father is a fool. He gambled high, lost everything, and then borrowed from people he never should have borrowed from. He paused, leaning back comfortably in his chair. But that's not your fault. Elena raised an eyebrow, surprised. And yet here I am. Yes, you are. Dante stood and walked to the window. He pulled back the curtain, and light flooded the room. Elena squinted. Through the window, she could see the well-kept garden, trimmed hedges, stone pathways. Everything perfectly controlled, like everything in this house, she suspected, like everything in this man's life. "Let me explain your situation," Dante said, still looking out the window. "Your father owed me 250,000 zloty. He doesn't have it. He'll probably never have it. In my world, when someone can't pay, there are consequences, usually violent ones." Elena swallowed hard but didn't interrupt. "But your father proposed a solution," Dante went on, finally turning to face her. "He suggested you could work for me until the debt is repaid. Or, as he put it, until I find some other use for you." Disgust flashed across Elena's face before she could hide it. Her own father had offered her up like merchandise. Dante saw the reaction, and his lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Yes, your reaction matches mine. Your father is a coward and a scoundrel." He walked back to the desk, leaned against its edge, crossed his arms. "But business is business. I accepted his offer. You're my property now, until that debt is paid." The words dropped between them like a stone. "My property." Elena felt nauseous, but she forced herself not to look away. "What does that mean? What will I be doing?" "That depends on you," Dante answered, and his voice softened, almost imperceptibly. "I'm not who people think I am, Elena. I'm not a monster. I run a business, a brutal one, sometimes, but I have principles. I don't hurt innocent people, and I don't force women into anything against their will." Elena wanted to believe him, but how could she? This man had bought her like property. His words, however pretty, didn't change that fact. "Then what are my options?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Dante studied her, long and intent. "You'll stay here, in this villa. You'll be treated with respect. You won't be a prisoner. You're free to move through the house and the grounds. In exchange, I'll have your company." "Company," Elena repeated, feeling the weight of the word on her tongue. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means whatever I want it to mean," Dante said, but there was no thread in his voice. "Conversation. Presence at dinner. Sometimes company at an event, if I need it. Nothing more, unless you want more. And if you never want more," he shrugged, "then nothing happens. I told you, I don't force women." Elena didn't know whether to believe him, but she saw something in his eyes, something that made her want to believe. Tiredness, maybe. Loneliness. Something human beneath the layers of control and power. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why any of this? If you're not going to hurt me, why did you even agree to this?" Dante looked away for the first time, seeming unsure. "Because your father had to pay. And if I didn't take you, I would have had to kill him. And then someone else, someone far worse than me, would have found a way to take you. At least here, you're safe." It was a truth Elena didn't want to hear, but she knew it was true. In the world her father moved in, the world of debts and violence, safety was an illusion. Maybe here, in this gilded cage, she at least had a chance to survive. "I understand," she said. Dante nodded finally. "Good. Maria will show you the rest of the house. You have access to everything, except my office and the basement. If you need anything, tell her." Elena stood, feeling strangely unburdened, though she knew this meeting had changed everything. As she reached the door, Dante's voice stopped her. She turned. He was watching her with something that might have been regret. "I'm sorry you're in this situation. You don't deserve it." She didn't answer. What was there to say? She left the study, closing the door behind her, leaving Dante Moretti alone with his books, his piano, and his complicated moral code that let him buy a woman but not hurt her. Elena didn't know what awaited her in this strange, luxurious prison, but she knew one thing. Dante Moretti wasn't what she'd expected. And somehow, that was even more frightening than the monster of the legends. The first days at the Moretti villa passed in a strange, unreal quiet. Elena moved through the great house like a ghost, learning its corners, its rhythms. Every morning she woke in the luxurious bed, and for a moment she'd forget where she was. Then it would all come rushing back. The weight of reality dropping onto her chest like a stone. She was the property of a man she barely knew, merchandise traded for her father's debts. But the days went by, and Dante Moretti remained an enigma. She saw him rarely, usually only at the dinners they shared in silence, broken only by the sound of cutlery against porcelain. He didn't push her to talk. He didn't demand anything. He simply sat there, on the other side of the table, sometimes reading documents, sometimes just eating quietly, as if his presence were a mere formality. It was the sixth night. Elena sat in the dining room, pushing her fork through a plate of risotto Maria had prepared. Dante was, as always, absorbed in paperwork, his brow furrowed in concentration. The tension between them wasn't hostile, it just existed. An invisible wall built from unspoken words and rules she didn't understand. "You're not eating," Dante observed suddenly, without looking up from the page. Elena raised an eyebrow. "I'm not hungry. You didn't eat yesterday either. Or the day before." Now he looked at her, those dark eyes piercing. "Maria's worried." "I'm worried. Are you worried about your merchandise?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended. Dante set down the documents and leaned back comfortably in his chair. There was no anger on his face, only something that might have been fatigue. "That's not what you are, Elena. You don't treat me like merchandise. But that's what I am, isn't it?" She felt weeks of frustration finally breaking loose. "I was bought. Sold. I have nowhere to go. I have no choice. That makes me merchandise, no matter how elegantly you dress it up." The silence that fell was thick. Dante studied her for a long moment, and something complicated moved through his eyes. Guilt, maybe. Or understanding. "You're right," he said finally, and the admission surprised her more than anything he could have said. "You're right. Your situation is unjust, and nothing I say will change that." Elena didn't know how to respond. She'd expected a defensive answer, maybe a threat. Not this, raw honesty. Dante stood, crossed to the bar in the corner of the dining room, and poured himself a whiskey. He raised the bottle toward her in a silent question. Elena nodded. Maybe the alcohol would help loosen the knot in her stomach. He brought her a glass and sat back down, but this time not at his place at the head of the table. He sat closer, only 2 seats away from her. A small change, but it felt significant. "Tell me about yourself," he said, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Why?" Elena asked. "What difference does it make?" "Maybe none. Maybe everything." He took a sip, watching her through the amber liquid. "You've been here almost a week, and I practically know nothing about you, except that your father betrayed you, and that you're brave enough to confront me." Elena drank her whiskey, feeling it burn her throat. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Anything. Who were you before all this?" It was a strange question. Who had she been? Elena had to think. That life, before the villa, before the debt, before all of it, already felt like it belonged to someone else. "I was studying Polish literature at Jagiellonian University," she began slowly. "I was in my 3rd year. I wanted to be a teacher, maybe a writer. I lived with my father. Worked part-time at a cafe to help with the bills. It was a normal life. Boring. But mine." Dante listened intently, without interrupting. It was strange, having his full attention, feeling like he was really listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak. "And then my father started gambling," Elena continued, feeling the bitterness rise again. "At first it was small bets, football, cards with friends on Friday nights. But then it got bigger. Casinos, poker rooms. He lost more than he won, of course, but he always thought the next bet would change everything. It never did." "Addiction," Dante said quietly. "It's a disease. It eats people from the inside. It ate him, and it took me down with him." Elena drank the rest of her whiskey in one swallow, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. "So that's what I am. Or was. Now I'm not sure who I am." Dante leaned forward, his face serious. "You're still yourself, Elena. This situation doesn't define you. It's just a circumstance that happened to you. Don't let it consume you." Easy for him to say. He wasn't a prisoner. But something in his tone made her want to believe him. Or at least made her want to try. "And you?" she asked, turning the tables. "Who are you, Dante Moretti? Besides a mob boss who buys people and runs illegal businesses." Instead of taking offense, Dante smiled slightly, the first genuine smile Elena had seen from him. It transformed his face, made him look younger, less threatening. "That's a complicated question," he answered. "I was born in Naples. My father was in the Camorra, the Neapolitan mafia. Growing up in that world wasn't a choice. It was all I knew: violence, loyalty, power. I was raised to take over his business after him." He paused, poured himself more whiskey. Elena waited, sensing there was more. "But I didn't want that life. I wanted to study, maybe become an architect. I loved buildings, the way space and structure can change how people live. It was pure, beautiful, nothing like the world I grew up in. What happened? Elena asked softly. My father was killed when I was 23. A war between clans. I had to take over, or everything my family had built would have been torn apart. So I took over. And I found out I was good at it. Too good. There was bitterness in his voice that echoed in Elena's chest. Both of them, trapped by other people's choices, by circumstances outside their control. A few years later, I moved the operation to Poland, Dante continued. Naples was too bloody. Too many old enemies, too much politics. Here I could start over, build something more civilized. Or that's what I told myself. But you're still in the mafia, Elena pointed out. You still hurt people. Yes, he admitted, without hesitation. I won't pretend I'm a saint, Elena. I've done things I regret. I've hurt people who deserved it, and some who didn't. That's the price of power in this world. Then why don't you leave if you hate it? Dante laughed, but it was a hollow sound. Because it's not that easy, is it? You don't just walk out of this family. Once you're in for good. The only way out is death. He looked at her, and Elena saw something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before, exhaustion. Not physical, a deep, spiritual weariness, from a man who had carried too much weight for too long. But I try to do it differently, he added quietly. I try to be better than my father. Less violence. More strategy. Protecting people who can't protect themselves. It's not much, but it's something. Elena didn't know what to say. This man was a contradiction, ruthless, yet compassionate. Dangerous, yet lonely. A criminal with a code of honor. Thank you, she said finally. For telling me. For listening. Dante stood, gathering the empty glasses. It's late. You should rest. Elena nodded and stood, but when she reached the dining room doors, she stopped. Dante turned, raising an eyebrow in question. Why the piano? In your study. You play. He smiled again, this time warmer. Yes. My mother taught me, before she died. Music was her escape. Now it's mine. Maybe someday you'll play for me, Elena said, surprising herself. Maybe, Dante answered, and in his eyes there was something that might have been hope. In the days that followed that conversation, something shifted. Dinners grew less tense. More words passed between them. Dante began telling Elena about his day, about the business in very general terms. Never details, never the violence, but about the challenges of running an empire, about loyalty and betrayal, about the weight of decisions. Elena told him about the books she was reading from the villa's vast library. She discovered Dante had surprisingly good literary taste. Polish works, Italian classics, Russian literature, contemporary fiction. They spent hours discussing Dostoevsky, discussing Sienkiewicz, discussing the philosophy of suffering and redemption running through those stories. Raskolnikov thought he was above the law, Elena said one afternoon, sitting in the library. Dante had just read her a passage from Crime and Punishment, his Italian accent giving the text a kind of melody. He thought his intelligence justified murder, but he fell apart under the weight of his guilt. Because you can't outrun your conscience, Dante answered, closing the book. No matter how much you try to rationalize your actions, part of you always knows the truth. Do you feel guilty? Elena asked. It was a personal question, maybe too personal, but she risked it. Dante watched the fire crackling in the hearth, his profile lit by the dancing shadows. Every day? For all the things I've done. For all the things I didn't do. For bringing you here. You saved me, Elena said quietly. The words surprised her, but saying them out loud, she understood they were true. If I weren't here, I'd be somewhere worse. Or dead. Dante turned to look at her. That doesn't justify what I did. Maybe not. But it makes you less of a monster than I thought. Something passed between them in that moment. A silent understanding. The beginning of something neither of them was ready to name yet. Elena felt it. An uncomfortable, unwanted attraction, but real. This man, who had bought her, who should have been everything she hated, was becoming something else. A complicated human being. Broken, but deeply human. Do you want to hear something? Dante asked suddenly, standing before Elena could answer. He was already walking toward the piano in the corner of the room. He sat down at the instrument, his fingers brushing the keys lightly. For a moment he sat in silence, as if gathering his nerve, and then he began to play. Music filled the room. A beautiful, melancholy melody that Elena recognized as Chopin's Second Nocturne. Dante's fingers moved fluidly over the keys, drawing out an emotion that struck straight at Elena's heart. She watched him, spellbound. This was a different man from the stern boss who had bought her. This was an artist, someone who understood beauty, who understood the sorrow that could be poured into music. When the last note faded into silence, Elena realized she was crying. Tears ran down her cheeks, silent and unstoppable. She wasn't sure why she was crying. Sadness, maybe, or beauty, or simply the relief of finally feeling something other than fear. Dante stood and came to her, holding out a handkerchief. She accepted it, wiping her face, suddenly embarrassed by her own emotional reaction. "Sorry," she whispered. "I don't know what came over me." "Don't apologize," Dante said gently. "Music is supposed to stir something. That's its purpose." He sat beside her on the sofa, closer than he'd ever sat before. Elena could feel his warmth, the scent of his cologne, something woody and expensive. Her heart beat faster, but not from fear. "Will you teach me?" she asked impulsively. "To play?" Dante smiled. "I'd love to." And so the piano lessons began. Each afternoon Elena went down to the library, where Dante waited by the instrument. He showed her how to place her fingers, how to read the notes, how to find rhythm and melody in the black and white keys. Elena wasn't a natural musician, but she was determined. And Dante was a patient teacher, gentle when she made mistakes, encouraging when she finally managed to play a simple melody through without error. Those lessons became her favorite part of the day, not just for the music, but for the closeness. Dante sat beside her on the bench, sometimes resting his hand over hers to correct her finger position. Those touches were electric, innocent, but charged with something unspoken. "Better," he said one afternoon, when Elena played a simple piece flawlessly. "You're starting to understand it." "I have a good teacher," Elena replied, turning to look at him. Their faces were close, barely inches apart. She could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the thin scar on his cheek she'd never asked about. The tension between them was palpable. Dante's eyes dropped to her lips, and Elena held her breath. Her heart pounding, he leaned in slightly, and she didn't pull away. "I want this," she realized, surprised. "I want him to kiss me." But at the last moment, Dante pulled back, looking away. "That's enough for today," he said, his voice a little rough. "I have work to do." He stood quickly and left the library, leaving Elena alone, her body still humming from the almost kiss. That night Elena lay in bed, unable to sleep, her mind spinning. What was happening to her? How could she feel drawn to the man who had bought her? It was madness, wrong, and yet it was there, a flame of desire that refused to go out. The next day, at dinner, Dante was distant, almost cold. Elena felt the space between them, and it hurt more than she wanted to admit. She tried to start a conversation, but his answers were short, polite, stripped of the warmth they'd built over the past few weeks. "Did I do something wrong?" she finally asked, unable to bear the tension. Dante looked at her, surprised. "No, of course not." "Then why are you so distant?" He set down his fork, rubbed his face with his hand. "Because I'm trying to be honorable, Elena. What I feel, what I've started to feel for you, isn't right. You're here against your will. It would be wrong of me to take advantage of this situation." Elena's heart raced. She felt the same way. It wasn't just her. "And if I wasn't being taken advantage of," she said quietly, "what if I feel something too?" Dante looked at her, intense. "You can't. This could be Stockholm Syndrome. Or, don't tell me what I feel." Elena cut in, her voice firm. "I'm not a child. I know what's happening. And yes, it's complicated and twisted and probably wrong, but that doesn't change the fact that it's here." She stood, moved toward him. Dante watched her, the conflict plain on his face. When she stood right in front of him, Elena reached out and touched his cheek. He didn't pull away. "You don't need to protect me from you," she whispered. "I need to protect myself. And I choose this." "Elena." His voice was tight, full of held-back need. "If we do this, everything changes. I won't be able to let you go. I won't want to." "Maybe I don't want you to let me go," she answered. And then she kissed him. For a moment, Dante went still, stunned. Then his arms wrapped around her, pulling her close, and he returned the kiss with an intensity that stole her breath. It wasn't a hungry kiss, desperate with weeks of held-back wanting. Elena felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. His lips were firm, commanding, but tender too, in a way that made her knees weak. Her fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, wanting more, wanting everything. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Dante rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Are you sure?" he whispered. "Because if we start this, there's no going back." Elena knew what he was really asking, not about the kiss, but about all of it. About the commitment. About surrendering to this complicated, impossible feeling between them. "I'm sure," she answered, and saying the words, she knew they were true. Dante opened his eyes and looked at her with such intensity that Elena felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. "Then come with me." He took her hand and led her through the house, up the stairs, down the hall, to the doors at the end, his bedroom. Elena had never been inside. It was his private sanctuary. He opened the door, and Elena stepped into a room that was surprisingly simple for his status. A large bed with white sheets, dark wood furniture, a few paintings on the walls. Nothing showy. Personal. Dante closed the door behind them and turned to face her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the tension between them thick as fog. "You're beautiful," he said quietly. "Since the first day I saw you. I knew you'd be my undoing." That night, everything that had been building between them for weeks finally gave way in the dark. There were no more words after that. Only her name in his voice, and his in hers, and the quiet, overwhelming certainty that whatever this was, it was real. When the first light of morning painted the sky in pink and gold, Elena lay in Dante's arms, listening to him breathe. Something had shifted between them forever, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like his. Elena woke in Dante's arms, the warmth of his body wrapped around her like a blanket. For a moment, she let herself simply exist in that instant, feeling his breath at the back of her neck, the weight of his arm across her waist, an intimacy that still felt surreal. Everything had changed that night. There was no going back now. She turned carefully to look at him. Dante was sleeping deeply, his face relaxed in a way she'd never seen while he was awake. Asleep, he looked younger, less burdened. Elena reached out and gently traced the line of his jaw, tracing the small scar on his cheek. His eyes opened, dark and instantly alert, focused on her. For a second, she saw something in his gaze, vulnerability, maybe even fear, before the control returned. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," Elena answered, feeling a blush rise in her cheeks. In the light of day, what they'd done the night before felt both more real and more impossible. Dante lifted a hand, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Elena shook her head. "No. You. Never." He kissed her softly, sweetly, so different from the desperate hunger of the night before. When they broke apart, his face turned serious. "But everything's changed, Elena. Do you understand that? I can't treat you like a debt anymore. You're mine now, in a different way." The words could have sounded possessive, but Elena heard the truth beneath them. This wasn't about ownership. It was about belonging. Now they belonged to each other. "What does that mean?" she asked, though she feared the answer. Dante sat up, leaning against the headboard. For a moment he seemed to be wrestling with something. A battle between what he wanted and what he knew was right. "It means I want to make you something more. Not just my companion. My wife." Elena sat up abruptly, staring at him in shock. "A wife, Dante, that's insane." "Yes," he finished for her, a faint smile on his lips. "It's insane. We've barely known each other a month. But in my world, Elena, words and actions have consequences. What happened between us can't be just something passing. Not for me." Elena felt her mind spinning. Marriage. To a mafia man. To the man who had bought her. And yet, looking into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected, sincerity. Maybe even love, in its earliest, most uncertain form. "But why marriage?" she asked. "Why couldn't we just be together?" Dante took her hands in his thumb tracing circles over her knuckles. "In my world, a woman I'm involved with is a target. If you're only my lover, my enemies, and I have many, will see you as a weakness to exploit. But if you're my wife, you're untouchable. You're protected by every resource I have. And more importantly, you're my equal, not my property." The logic was twisted, but Elena was beginning to understand the rules of the world Dante moved in. Everything was about power, about perception, about sending the right signals to the right people. "And what about love?" she asked quietly. A marriage without love is just a contract. Dante looked at her with an intensity that took her breath away. Who said there's no love? Maybe it's not love yet. Not fully. But it's something real, and I think it can become love if we give it the chance. Elena knew it should be easy to refuse him. It should be impossible, unthinkable. But looking at Dante, this complicated man who played Chopin and read Dostoevsky and carried the weight of his world alone, she couldn't say no. I need to think about it, she said finally. It's a big decision. Dante nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. Of course. Take all the time you need. Then he paused, his face darkening. There are things you need to know about my world. About the dangers. If we're going to be together, either way, you need to know the truth. Fear moved through Elena, but she nodded. Tell me. Over the next few hours, Dante explained the realities of his life. He told her about his organization, not every detail, but enough for her to understand its scale. He controlled a substantial share of the illegal operations in Krakow and the surrounding cities. Loan sharking, illegal casinos, money laundering. He had people in government, in the police, in business. His empire was vast and well protected, but it also had enemies. Other bosses who wanted his territory. Rivals from his past in Naples who had never forgotten old grudges. And the most dangerous of all, Marco Salvatore, a man who had once been his partner and was now his sworn enemy. Marco and I were friends, Dante explained, his voice hard. We built this business together. But he got too brutal, too ruthless. He killed without reason. He hurt innocent people. I had to force him out of the organization. Now he wants to destroy me. Take everything I've built. How dangerous is he? Elena asked, feeling a chill run down her spine. Very, Dante admitted. He's already tried to kill me twice. Unsuccessfully. But it's only a matter of time before he tries again. And if he finds out about you, about what you mean to me, he didn't finish the sentence, but Elena understood. She would become a target. Maybe I should leave, she said, though the words hurt. Maybe it would be safer for both of us if I just disappeared. Dante gripped her shoulders, his hold firm but not painful. No, you're not leaving. I've already lost too much in my life, Elena. I won't lose you too. His eyes were intense, burning with determination. I'll protect you. I promise. No one will hurt you. Elena wanted to believe him, but the fear was real, tangible, settling in her stomach like a stone. The days that followed were a strange mix of happiness and anxiety. Elena and Dante became inseparable, spending every free moment together. The piano lessons continued, now interrupted by kisses, by touches, by intimate laughter. They cooked together, read together, talked late into the night about everything and nothing. Elena discovered Dante had a dry sense of humor that came out when he was relaxed. He loved old Italian films, could quote The Godfather from memory, joking about the irony of his own life. He was surprisingly good in the kitchen, taught by his mother before her death, and made the best carbonara Elena had ever tasted. But there was a dark side too. Men in suits came and went for meetings in Dante's study. The phone rang at strange hours. Sometimes Dante went out at night, coming back late with a tension on his face that didn't fade for hours. Elena didn't ask for details. She wasn't sure she wanted to know them. Loving this man meant accepting part of what he did, if not all of it. On a rainy December afternoon, 3 weeks after that first night together, Dante took Elena to an elegant restaurant in the heart of Krakow. It was tucked away, intimate, the kind of place important people went for privacy. The waiters treated Dante with a respect that bordered on fear. They sat in a private booth, candles flickering between them, the tablecloth white as snow. Elena wore a dress Dante had bought her, deep burgundy silk that fit her figure perfectly. She felt beautiful, wanted, in a way she'd never experienced before. You look beautiful, Dante said, his eyes dark with want. So do you, she answered. And it was true. He wore a dark suit, white shirt, no tie, his hair carefully styled. He looked like a man who could run the world, and in a sense, he did. Dinner was excellent, rich dishes, perfect wine, conversation that flowed easily between them as it always did. But Elena sensed Dante was nervous, as if he were bracing for something. When the waiter cleared their dessert plates, Dante reached across the table and took her hands. Elena, he began, his voice serious. These past few weeks have been the happiest of my life. You make me believe I can be something more than what I was. Something better. Elena's heart began to race. She knew what was coming. Dante pulled a small box from his pocket, velvet-covered, and opened it, revealing a beautiful ring, a diamond surrounded by rubies, glinting in the candlelight. I know this is fast. I know our circumstances have been unconventional, but I also know I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you. Elena Kowalska, will you marry me? Tears filled Elena's eyes. For weeks, she'd dreamed of this moment. She'd feared it. She'd wondered if it was real, if it could last. And now, here it was, a proposal from the man she'd come to love, against every expectation. Yes, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Yes, I'll marry you. The smile that lit Dante's face was the purest joy Elena had ever seen from him. He took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, of course. Dante left nothing to chance. He stood, came around the table, and kissed her deeply, not caring about the waiters or the other guests who might be watching. In that moment, there was only the two of them, the world narrowing down to the space between their beating hearts. I love you, Dante whispered against her lips. Words he'd never said before. I love you too, Elena answered. And she meant it, against all logic, against reason. She loved this complicated, dangerous man. They drove home euphoric, hands intertwined, planning a future that suddenly seemed bright. Maybe a small wedding, Dante suggested. Just close friends. Maybe something bigger, Elena countered, laughing at his reluctance for ceremony. Maybe a honeymoon in Italy, to meet the rest of your family. Maybe children someday, once everything's safer. They had it all planned, the life they'd build together. But life in Dante's world left no room for plans. The Mercedes pulled up in front of the villa's gate, waiting for it to open. Dante was tracing circles with his thumb over Elena's fingers, planning wedding details, when suddenly something exploded, a blinding light and a deafening roar that swallowed the world. Everything became chaos. The car shook violently, windows shattering, fragments flying everywhere. Elena felt something hot running down her face. Blood, she realized, dazed. Her ears were ringing. Her vision blurred. Elena, Dante's voice, screaming, desperate, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her down, shielding her with his body. The car doors were torn open, hands grabbing, violent, dragging her out. Dante fought back, his fist connecting with something. Shouts, curses in Italian and Polish. Get her out. Now. A voice Elena didn't recognize, cold, commanding. She saw Dante bleeding from a cut on his forehead, fighting like a man possessed to reach her. But there were 3, 4 of them. Too many. They struck him, a brutal blow connecting with his jaw, and he went down. Dante! Elena screamed, her voice breaking. She tried to reach him, but the arms holding her were like steel. The last thing she saw before something dark was pulled over her face was Dante sprawled on the ground, blood dripping onto the pavement, his eyes closed. And then there was only darkness. Elena woke in a cold, dark place. Her head throbbed, her whole body ached. She tried to move her hands and realized they were bound behind her back, rough rope cutting into her skin. Her legs were tied too, bound to the legs of a chair. Panic tore through her, sharp and violent. Where was she? What had happened to Dante? Was he alive? Finally awake, said a voice in the darkness, deep, amused, familiar, and sinister. A light snapped on, blinding her. Elena squinted, slowly adjusting to the glare. She was in what looked like a warehouse, concrete walls, high ceilings, boarded windows. And standing in front of her, with a smile that chilled her blood, was a tall man, around 40, with dark hair and a menacing scar running through his right eyebrow. He wore an expensive suit but wore it badly, as if elegance didn't come naturally to him. Who are you? Elena whispered, though part of her already knew. Marco Salvatore. He introduced himself with a mocking bow. Dante's former partner. His current enemy. You've probably heard of me. Elena remembered the name. The man Dante had warned her about. The most dangerous of his enemies. What do you want? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear tearing through her. Marco laughed. It was cold. Oh, I think you know what I want. I want to watch Dante suffer. I want to take away everything he loves. And now, thanks to you, I know exactly how to do it. He stepped closer, his shoes echoing on the concrete floor. Elena flinched back instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. Dante took everything from me. Marco continued, his voice thick with venom. My business, my reputation, my men. He left me with nothing. So now I'm going to take the one thing that matters to him. You. He'll find you, Elena said, trying to sound more certain than she felt. And he'll kill you for this. Oh, I know he'll try, Marco agreed. That's part of the fun, watching him try, desperate, powerless. And then, when he thinks he has a chance to save you, I'll take it away. He'll have to live with knowing he couldn't protect you. The fear Elena felt shifted into something else. Rage. This man, this monster, saw her only as a tool, a way to hurt Dante. She wasn't a person to him, not a human being. She was an object, a piece in his game of revenge. You're a coward, she said, looking at him with defiance. You hide behind defenseless women because you're too weak to face Dante directly. Marco's smile dropped in a fast, brutal motion. He struck her across the face, the impact jolting through her jaw. Elena cried out, tasting blood. Watch your tongue, Marco growled. You might be valuable to me alive, but that doesn't mean I can't make you wish you were dead. He turned and walked into the shadows, leaving Elena alone in the cold, dark warehouse. Tears rose in her eyes, but she forced them back. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Dante would come. She knew it. He'd find her, whatever it took. She just had to survive long enough for that to happen. The hours passed, though Elena lost all sense of time. There were no windows, no light except a single bulb hanging overhead. Her hands were numb from the ropes, her body stiff from sitting in the same position. She tried working at the bindings, twisting her wrists, testing the rope. It hurt, the skin raw and bleeding, but she could feel it give, just slightly. Maybe with enough time, she could get free. But time was running out. Marco came back. This time he wasn't alone. Two men flanked him, both large, both looking like the type who enjoyed inflicting pain. Good news, Marco said, his tone falsely cheerful. Your beloved is on your trail. My men tell me he's combing every inch of this city, looking for you. Truly touching. Let me go, Elena demanded, though she knew it was useless. Marco shook his head, clicking his tongue. Not yet, sweetheart. The fun's only just starting. But don't worry, I won't kill you yet. First, I'll give Dante the chance for a heroic rescue. And then, his smile was pure malice. Well, we'll see. He motioned to his men. One of them grabbed Elena's chair, lifted it, and began dragging her toward another part of the warehouse. Elena struggled, trying to break free, but it was useless. They were too strong, too determined. They left her in a small, locked room, an old office, maybe. The only light came through a crack in the door. Elena could hear Marco and his men talking outside, their voices low but excited. She was alone, frightened, but not without hope. Dante was coming. She knew it. And when he did, Marco Salvatore would regret the day he decided to cross him. Elena worked at the bindings with renewed determination, ignoring the pain, ignoring the fear. She would get free. She would find a way. She had to. Because if she didn't, everything she'd fought for, everything she'd come to believe in, would be lost. And Elena Kowalska wasn't someone who gave up easily. Dante Moretti stood in his ruined study, staring at a map of Krakow spread across his desk, every possible hideout marked with a red X. 3 days. 3 days since Marco had taken Elena. 3 days of a hell that tore through every cell of his body. His face was bruised, purple along his jaw where one of Marco's men had struck him during the attack. He had a few broken ribs, each breath a reminder of his failure. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the torment in his mind. Elena was out there somewhere, scared, maybe hurt, and he couldn't find her. Boss, a voice said behind him. It was Luca, his right-hand man, loyal through every one of these years. We've got something. One of the informants heard rumors. An old warehouse in Podgorze, next to an abandoned factory. Marco's people were seen there. Dante turned sharply, ignoring the sharp pain in his side. You're sure? 80%, Luca answered. It's the best lead we've had. 80% would have to be enough. Dante couldn't wait for certainty. Every minute Elena spent in Marco's hands was 1 minute too many. Gather the men, he ordered, his voice hard as steel. All of them. We move now. 20 minutes later, a convoy of black cars tore through the nighttime streets of Krakow, engines roaring in the silence. Dante sat in the front seat of the lead car, a machine gun across his lap, his mind fixed on one goal, getting Elena back. He didn't care how many men he had to go through. He didn't care about the consequences, about the war this would start. Marco Salvatore had signed his own death sentence the moment he touched her. The warehouse emerged from the darkness, a large, decaying building on the edge of an industrial district. No lights, no visible guards. But Dante knew better. Marco would be waiting, ready for the confrontation. Surround the building. Dante murmured to his men over the radio. No one gets in, no one gets out. And I want Marco alive. He's mine. His men scattered, silent and professional as shadows. Dante waited, every nerve on edge, every sense alert. This was the moment that would decide everything. Either he'd save Elena, or he'd lose her forever. Inside the warehouse, Elena had finally managed what had seemed impossible. She'd freed her wrists. The rope was slick with her blood, but it had loosened enough for her hands to slip free. Her fingers were numb, pins and needles shooting through them as the blood finally flowed freely. She worked on the bindings at her ankles, her fingers clumsy but determined. She could hear voices outside her small prison, Marco and his men, arguing about something. This was her chance. The last knot gave. Elena was free. She stood slowly, her legs nearly buckling after days of sitting. She leaned against the wall, waiting for the dizziness to pass, listening to the sounds beyond the door. There was a window in the far corner of the room, small and high, but maybe just big enough to fit through. Elena dragged an old desk beneath it. She climbed up, ignoring her body's protests. The window was sealed shut by years of neglect. Elena pulled, pushed, her nails tearing against the wood. Finally it gave, opening with a loud screech that seemed deafening in the silence. What was that? Marco's voice, sharp and suspicious. Elena didn't wait. She hauled herself through the window, ignoring the rough concrete scraping her skin, and dropped down the other side, landing hard on the pavement below. Pain exploded in her knee, but she forced herself up, forced herself to run. She was outside the building, in a narrow alley between the warehouse and an old fence. The moon was hidden behind clouds, the darkness nearly total. Elena ran, her bare feet silent on the cold ground, her lungs burning as she gulped the freezing winter air. She'd escaped. A shout behind her, Marco's voice, white with fury. Find her. Now. Elena could hear them coming, footsteps pounding on the concrete, voices shouting in Italian and Polish. She ran faster, rounding a corner, desperately searching for somewhere to hide, some way to escape. And then she saw them, headlights cutting through the warehouse gate. Her heart leaped. Was it the police? Was it Marco's reinforcements? A figure jumped from the first car, familiar even in the darkness, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with lethal grace. Dante! Elena screamed, her voice breaking. I'm here. He spun, his head turning toward her direction. Even from a distance, she could see the moment he saw her. Relief, joy, and pure, unspeakable rage toward every person who had hurt her. Elena ran toward him. His men fanned out behind him, weapons drawn and ready. But Marco's men were faster. They poured out of the warehouse, 10, maybe 12 men, all armed. And at the front of them was Marco himself, his face twisted with fury. You thought you could just take her back, he shouted, raising a gun. She's mine now. Everything happened at once. Dante lunged forward, closing the distance between himself and Elena in seconds. His hands grabbed her, pushing her to the ground, his body shielding her as gunfire erupted around them. Elena heard shouting, the clash of metal against metal, the dull thud of bullets hitting concrete. Dante held her tight, his heart pounding against hers, his breath hot in her hair. Stay down, he whispered fiercely. Don't move. But Elena could feel something hot and wet soaking through his shirt. Blood. Dante was bleeding. You're hurt. Panic tore through her. It's nothing, he growled. But his face was pale, his jaw clenched with pain. I have to get you out of here. The gunfire continued. Dante's men returned fire with professional precision. Elena heard cries of the wounded, the heavy sounds of men fighting in close quarters. It was chaos, a war unfolding around them. Dante pulled Elena up with him. Run, he ordered, pushing her toward the cars. Now. But Marco wasn't finished. He emerged from the smoke and chaos, his gun aimed directly at Elena. If I can't have you, he snarled, no one can. Time slowed. Elena saw Marco's finger tightening on the trigger, saw the intent to kill in his eyes. She screamed, trying to move, but her feet were rooted to the spot. Dante moved. He threw himself in front of her, his body forming a shield between her and the bullet. The shot rang out through the night, loud as thunder. Dante collapsed, his knees giving way. Elena caught him, her hands grasping desperately, trying to hold him up. No! Dante screamed. No! Another shot tore through the air, but this one didn't come from Marco. Lucas stood behind him, his gun still smoking. Marco looked down in shock at the bloom of blood spreading across his chest, and then he fell face first, dead before he hit the ground. The fight ended as fast as it had begun. Marco's men were dead or fleeing, broken by the force and determination of Dante's elite. But none of that mattered. Nothing mattered except the man in Elena's arms, his blood seeping between her fingers. Dante! Elena sobbed, tears streaming down her face. Please, stay with me. His eyes opened, focusing on her with difficulty. Elena, he whispered, his voice weak. You're safe. That's all that matters. No, Elena sobbed. No, you can't leave me. You promised me a future. You promised me a life together. Luca was there, kneeling beside them. Ambulance is on the way. Hold on, boss. You've got a wife to marry, remember? Dante smiled faintly, his hand rising to touch Elena's cheek. My beautiful Elena. My redemption. You're not going to die, Elena ordered, her voice fierce. Do you hear me? I won't let you. His eyes began to close. Elena shook him, desperate, terrified. Dante, stay with me. The sirens tore through the night, drawing closer, red and blue lights painting the scene in surreal color. The paramedics arrived, running, professional and efficient, pulling Elena back as they worked on Dante. Elena watched helplessly as they lifted him onto a stretcher, his blood bright against the white sheet. She didn't let go of his hand, holding it tight, as if her touch alone could keep him in this world with her. She's coming with him, Lucas said, opening the ambulance doors for her. I'm not letting her go. Neither are you. Elena climbed into the ambulance, still gripping Dante's hand, her eyes never leaving his face. The sirens screamed again as the vehicle tore through the night streets, every second stretching like an eternity. Stay with me, she whispered over and over. A prayer and a command. Please, stay. The hospital was a blur of bright lights and white walls. The doctors took Dante immediately, pushing him through double doors that closed in Elena's face. She stood in the hallway, covered in Dante's blood, her body shaking with tremors she couldn't control. Luca guided her to the waiting room, gently pushing her into a chair. Someone brought her a blanket, but the cold she felt didn't come from outside. It came from within, from a deep-rooted fear that she'd just lost the only person who had ever made her feel whole. The hours passed. Elena sat motionless, her eyes fixed on those double doors, waiting, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in. Dante's men came and went, their faces full of worry. Maria, the house manager, appeared at some point, wrapping Elena in a tight embrace, her own tears wetting Elena's cheek. He's strong, Maria whispered. He'll survive for you. Elena wanted to believe that. She had to believe it. Finally, as the first light of dawn began filtering through the hospital windows, a doctor came out. His face was tired, but there was something in his eyes that gave Elena hope. He's stable, the doctor said, and those two words were the most beautiful Elena had ever heard. The bullet went through his shoulder. It damaged some muscle, but it missed the major arteries. He lost a lot of blood, but he's strong. He should make a full recovery. Elena broke down, weeks of tension and fear finally releasing in uncontrollable sobs. Luca held her, letting her cry against his shoulder, his own relief visible in the way his shoulders shook. Can I see him? Elena asked, when she could finally speak. He's unconscious, the doctor warned. But yes, you can see him. The room they took her to was quiet and well-lit. Dante lay in the bed, pale but breathing, monitors beeping steadily around him. His shoulder was bandaged tightly, and four in his hand feeding fluids and medication. Elena approached the bed, her fingers trembling as she touched his face. Warm, alive, real. You made it, she whispered, her voice breaking. You saved me again. She sat in the chair beside the bed, took his hand in hers, and stayed there, watching him, waiting for him to wake. It took 2 days. 2 days of vigil at his bedside, eating little, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair, refusing to leave his side. Maria brought her food, clean clothes, but Elena barely noticed. Her world had narrowed down to the man in the bed and the sound of his breathing. On the third day, Dante's eyes finally opened. He looked around, confused for a moment, and then his gaze found Elena. A smile, weak but real, reached his lips. "Hi," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "Hi," Elena answered, her own smile breaking into fresh tears. "Welcome back. Did you miss me?" Even now, weak and wounded, he tried to joke. "Every second," Elena said honestly. She leaned in, kissed his forehead softly. "I thought I'd lost you." "You can't get rid of me that easily," Dante answered. His hand squeezed hers, weak but determined. "I promised you a future. I'm not breaking that promise." The following weeks were a blur of recovery and rebuilding. Dante returned to the villa, his shoulder in a sling, but his spirit intact. Elena never left his side, caring for him with a dedication that even surprised her. But something had changed in Dante. Elena could see it in the way he looked at the world around him, in the silence that settled over him during the long hours. Nearly losing Elena, nearly losing his own life, had shifted something deep inside him. "I want out," he said one evening, sitting in the library. His shoulder was healing well, but the scar would remain, a physical reminder of the cost of his life. Elena looked at him, surprised. "Out of the business," he explained. "Out of the mafia. Out of all of it. It almost killed you, Elena. It almost killed me. I can't keep doing this. Not if I want a life with you." "But it's all you know," Elena said quietly. "You can still get out." Dante smiled bitterly. "I always said the only way out was death. Maybe I almost died enough. Maybe this is my chance at a second beginning." It took months. Dante began systematically disentangling himself from his operations, handing control to trusted men, closing some businesses entirely. It wasn't clean. There was resistance, disputes, violence. But Dante was strategic, patient, unyielding. And through all of it, Elena stood by his side, not just as a witness, but as a partner, offering perspective, advice, a presence that kept him grounded when everything seemed to be falling apart. Finally, on a warm May afternoon, nearly 6 months after the attack, Dante made his final transaction. He passed the rest of his empire to Luca, the man he trusted most, the man who had proven his loyalty 10 times over. "It's yours now," Dante said, placing a hand on Luca's shoulder. "Run it better than I did." Luca nodded, emotion visible on his face. "They'll miss you, boss." "I'm not the boss anymore," Dante answered. "I'm just a man trying to find his way." And then he was free. For the first time in his adult life, Dante Moretti wasn't a mafia boss. He was simply a man engaged to the woman he loved, with a future that wasn't written in blood. The wedding was small, intimate, exactly as they both wanted it. A few close friends, Maria, Luca, and his family. It took place in the villa's garden, among blooming roses, under a warm sun that painted everything in golden light. Elena wore a simple white dress, elegant in its simplicity. Dante wore a dark suit, his shoulder finally healed, though the scar was still there, a reminder of what they'd survived. As they stood before the priest, hands joined, exchanging vows, Elena felt like every part of her journey had led to this moment. All the pain, all the fear, all of it had led here, to this man, to this commitment. "I take you, Dante Moretti, as my husband," she said, her voice clear and steady. "To love, respect, and cherish from this day forward." "I take you, Elena Kowalska, as my wife," Dante answered, his eyes bright with emotion. "To love, protect, and honor for all the days of my life." The kiss that sealed their vows was sweet and careful, a promise of all the years to come. When they broke apart, the guests applauded, but for Elena and Dante, only each other existed, the world falling away until only they remained. Months later, Elena discovered she was pregnant. The news arrived as both a surprise and a joy, the fulfillment of dreams she hadn't known she had. When she told Dante, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. Pure, unfiltered joy, eyes bright with tears of happiness. "We're going to be parents," he whispered, his hand gentle over her still flat stomach. "We'll build a life together. Are you ready for this?" Elena asked, her own anxiety mixing with excitement. No, Dante admitted honestly. But I'll learn. For you, for our baby. I'll be the best father I can be. And he was. When their daughter, Lucia, was born on a winter morning 9 months later, Dante held her with such gentleness, such wonder, that Elena cried at the sheer beauty of it. Lucia had Dante's eyes, dark and intense, but her mother's smile, warm and joyful. She was perfect, a tiny person who embodied everything they'd fought for, everything they'd worked so hard to build. She's beautiful, Dante whispered, unable to tear his eyes from his daughter. Elena watched him, her heart swelling with a love so intense it almost hurt. This man, who had once been a mafia boss, brutal and ruthless, held his daughter with a tenderness that betrayed every sharp edge he'd ever had. We're a family, Elena said quietly. We're a family, Dante repeated, looking at her with tears on his cheeks. And I'll give them everything: protection, love, a life without violence, without fear. I promise. And he kept that promise. The years that followed weren't perfect. Life never is. But they were good. They were happy. Dante found a new passion in architecture, the passion he'd once abandoned so long ago. He began studying again, taking courses, finally living the dream he'd thought was lost. Over time, he built a small firm, designing buildings that were beautiful and functional, spaces that made people feel safe and valued. Elena went back to her studies, finished her degree in literature, and began working as a teacher. She loved it. Sharing her love of books and words with a younger generation gave her purpose, a fulfillment beyond her roles as wife and mother. Lucia grew up surrounded by love, never knowing her father's dark past, never feeling the weight of the world he'd once lived in. She was a bright, curious child, with a laugh that filled the house with joy. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Elena thought back on everything that had happened. Her father, who had betrayed her, the debt that had changed her life, Marco and his revenge, nearly losing everything. It all felt like another life, like a story that had happened to someone else. But the scars were still there, physical ones, thin white lines on her wrists from the ropes, the scar on Dante's shoulder from the bullet that had almost killed him, and emotional ones, memories that still sometimes woke her in the night, the fear that surfaced when Dante came home late. But they were together, and that was all that mattered. One afternoon, when Lucia was almost 5, Elena and Dante sat in their garden, watching their daughter play in the grass. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, the day drifting into a warm evening. Do you regret it? Dante asked suddenly, his voice calm. Elena looked at him, surprised. Regret what? Everything. How we met. What you had to go through. If you could go back and choose a different path, would you? Elena considered the question. She really thought about it. There were things she wished had been different. The way it began, the pain and fear she'd experienced. But the outcome, the man beside her, the daughter laughing under the sun, the life they'd built. No, she said finally, taking Dante's hand. I don't regret any of it, because all of it led here. To you, to her, to this family. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. Dante smiled, that rare, genuine smile he saved only for her and their daughter. He leaned in, kissed her softly. A kiss that tasted like future and promise. I love you, Elena Moretti, he whispered against her lips. I love you too, she answered. Always will. And as they sat there, watching their little girl play beneath the setting sun, Elena knew it was true. Their love had been born from darkness and violence, but it had grown into something beautiful, something lasting. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. Dante Moretti, the man who had once been a mafia boss, found his redemption, not by erasing his past, but by building a future worthy of its weight, choosing every day to be better, to love harder, to protect what mattered most. And Elena, the woman who had once been sold to pay a debt, found her strength, not by escaping her fate, but by transforming it into something extraordinary, choosing love over fear, hope over despair, life over mere survival. Together, they built something real, something lasting, a family rooted in love that had survived the fire and come out stronger. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the three of them, father, mother, daughter, sat together in the garden Dante had planted with his own hands, in the house filled with laughter and light, in the life they chose, every single day, again and again. This was their story. This was their redemption. This was their happy ending, not because it was perfect, but because it was theirs. And that was more than enough.